Have you ever noticed that Vladimir Putin has shown up alongside most US presidents over the past few decades? But what's really behind this Russian leader, who could remain in power until 2036, potentially outlasting even Stalin's era? In this video, we're going to reveal how a former KGB officer rose to the top in Russia, manipulated laws, and ruthlessly used propaganda, all to stay in command for more than 20 years. Get ready to discover the most surprising behind-the-scenes moments in Vladimir Putin's journey. But before we talk about these pictures, let's go back to a pivotal moment. It was December 31st, 1999, when Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse, announced his resignation, citing health issues and abysmal approval ratings. That's how Vladimir Putin, who was prime minister at the time, officially took the presidency for the first time. And of course, it wouldn't be his last. From that point on, Putin turned Russia into something close to an autocracy. He invaded two neighbouring countries, both former Soviet republics, and strengthened ties with Syria and Iran, positioning himself against growing US influence. At the same time, he faced allegations of meddling in other nations' elections, like the US in 2016, and was hit with multiple sports doping scandals involving Russian athletes. In case you didn't know, he was once an agent of the KGB, the formidable Soviet intelligence service that operated from 1954 to 1991. Although he studied law, he spent over 15 years as a spy, something that undoubtedly shaped his worldview and the way he handles threats and alliances. Putin's style of governance blends features of the old Russian imperial absolutism with a dash of Soviet propaganda machinery. That's why many describe him as a Cuenca 21st century Czar, ruling a country that, in practice, is far from a real democracy. There, most major media outlets are in the hands of oligarchs with close ties to the Kremlin, and anyone daring to criticize or threaten Putin's grip on power can be silenced, sometimes in very drastic ways. More than 2 decades have passed since Yeltsin's resignation. During this time, the US has changed presidents 4 times, while Russia has effectively remained under Vladimir Putin's command. That's no coincidence. To maintain power, he's used a variety of maneuvers, some clever, some not so much. These tactics range from revamping election laws to employing heavy propaganda and repression. Today, some say Putin might end up staying in power longer than Stalin did. But how is that possible? Well, to understand how Putin really got to the top, and how he might remain there until 2036, we need to rewind the clock a bit and look at not only Putin's personal journey, but also the chaos that gripped Russia after the Soviet collapse, leading up to Yeltsin's resignation. Putin was born in October 1952 in what was then the Soviet city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, just 7 years after the end of World War II. Both his father and mother, factory workers, survived terrifying events under the Nazi regime, including the Siege of Leningrad, one of the most brutal in history. During World War II, the Soviet Union was forced into the conflict when Hitler, who had already invaded countries like Austria and Poland, broke a non-aggression pact and decided to attack Soviet territory. Consequently, the USSR joined forces with France, Britain, and the United States, forming the allies who defeated the Axis: Germany, Italy, and Japan. Putin's father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, fought in that war. Meanwhile, his mother endured the Siege of Leningrad, in which the city spent nearly 900 days lacking adequate food or clean water. Starvation and freezing to death were commonplace, and some people were even mistakenly declared dead simply after fainting from hunger. According to Putin, his mother experienced that exact scenario. She passed out, was presumed dead, but miraculously came back to life. Putin's 2 older brothers died in childhood, long before he was born. Because of so many losses, the family lived very humbly in a communal apartment, without proper heating or hot water. Putin himself has recounted in a book how he used to chase the rats that infested the building, until one of them turned on him, teaching him that cornered enemies can respond in unpredictable ways. His mother once worked sweeping streets and cleaning labs for almost symbolic pay, while young Putin was said to have quite the temper at school. He'd throw chalkboard erasers at classmates and get into fights. yet he excelled in history and German. During his teenage years, he took up combat sports, sambo, a fighting style developed by the Soviet Red Army, and judo, and even authored a book on the subject years later. By around 14 or 15, his academic performance improved dramatically. He was accepted into a top high school, becoming one of the best students, especially in subjects requiring discipline and heavy reading. This sense of personal overcoming would resurface in several phases of his life, including politics. But before all that, World War II had ended in 1945, turning the US and the Soviet Union into two global superpowers that would dominate the international stage for the next 40 years. This laid the groundwork for the Cold War, characterized by scientific, technological, and space race competitions, and, of course, a nuclear arms race that kept the entire world on edge. Putin grew up during this era, which unquestionably shaped his worldview. After finishing high school, Putin enrolled in law at St. Petersburg State University. There, he met Anatoly Sobchak, who taught business law and would later play a pivotal role in Putin's political career. Soon after graduating, Putin fulfilled his dream. He joined the KGB, the infamous Soviet security and intelligence agency, responsible for covert operations abroad and domestic crackdown at home. This was the peak of the Cold War, and the KGB was seen as nearly omnipotent, with powers ranging from espionage and arbitrary arrests to assassinations and the notorious practice of disinformation. At that time, the Soviet government, believing that the ends justify the means, did everything possible to protect the state's reputation. The Chernobyl disaster, for instance, was initially covered up by the authorities, and the KGB played a key role in delaying any international alert. It was only when radiation levels were detected in Sweden that the USSR was forced to reveal the extent of the accident. Putin served in the KGB from 1975 to 1991, spending a considerable amount of time in East Germany, the area under Soviet control, since World War II ended. However, the exact nature of his activities there remains unclear. Some reports suggest he was involved in supplying weapons and support to local groups, but there are no officially confirmed details. What we do know is that he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 up close, a moment that symbolized the end of the Soviet Empire and the start of a new historical chapter, one in which he would become a key figure. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced a severe economic crisis. Mikhail Gorbachev, the final Soviet leader, introduced the policies of perestroika and glasnost, but they weren't enough to save the regime. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the once divided Germany was reunited. Shortly thereafter, in 1991, the USSR officially ceased to exist, splitting into 15 independent republics, one of which, the Russian Federation, was led by Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev faced an attempted coup, which failed, while around the same time Putin left the KGB and returned to St. Petersburg. Anatoly Sobchak then became the city's mayor and invited Putin to serve as his deputy. Jumping straight from clandestine espionage to public life, Putin embarked on his rise through Russia's political ranks. Meanwhile, Yeltsin, seen initially as charismatic and eager to maintain good relations with the West, particularly the US, took the reins of the newly formed Russia. Early on, he enjoyed decent approval, but it soon became clear the country was in turmoil. The economy was frail, inflation skyrocketed, and mass privatizations took place. In an effort to reform Russia, Yeltsin sold off thousands of state-owned enterprises, giving birth to the term Russian oligarchs, a small circle who acquired these companies at bargain prices, amassing enormous power and, most notably, controlling a large portion of the media. Around this same period, Putin, as deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, started building relationships with these oligarchs. He earned respect and won over influential groups, rising as a promising figure. It wasn't long before he was appointed Yeltsin's prime minister toward the end of the 1990s. Then, on December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin shocked everyone by stepping down. And who took over the highest office? Vladimir Putin, of course. The year 2000 began with him already at the helm, ready to impose his governing style on Russia. The year 2000 kicked off with Vladimir Putin dealing with terrorist attacks supposedly carried out by Chechen extremists. In August 1999, a series of apartment bombings in Russia killed over 300 people. Using these attacks as justification, Putin blamed Chechen radicals, annexed the region, and gained overwhelming public support. Later it came out that these attacks might have been carried out by FSB agents, successor to the KGB, as a training exercise. At the time, though, it wasn't widely known, and Putin's popularity soared from a mere 2% approval rating to around 45%. With that surge, he won the 2000 elections. Soon enough, his administration gained a reputation for corruption. However, unlike Yeltsin, who seemed to answer to the oligarchs, Putin quickly made them answer to him, rewarding loyalty and punishing anyone who dared to oppose him. This secured him near total control of the media. In other words, most outlets, which were already owned by a handful of billionaires, became essentially mouthpieces for the Kremlin. Once in power, Putin ordered military operations in Georgia, Crimea, and more recently, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As a result, a large part of the Western world imposed sanctions on Russia. But domestically, he hasn't lost as much support as you might expect, largely thanks to relentless pro-Kremlin propaganda and a strong sense of nationalism built up over many years. According to the Russian constitution, a president can only serve 2 consecutive terms. But there's no cap on the total number of terms over a lifetime. That's how Putin served from 2000 to 2004, and from 2004 to 2008. Then, because he couldn't immediately run for a 3rd consecutive term, he tapped Dmitry Medvedev to succeed him while he took on the role of Prime Minister. Later, Putin returned to the presidency with a landslide victory and then approved reforms that could keep him in power until 2036, potentially surpassing even Stalin's time at the helm of the old USSR. Beyond these legal maneuvers, he uses 2 main strategies to preserve his dominance. 1. Eliminating opponents and critics. Russia is considered one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist. There's a long list of Putin's adversaries who've been killed or imprisoned. Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer, accused Putin's administration of large-scale corruption, orchestrating the murder of oligarch Boris Berezovsky, carrying out apartment building bombings to boost Putin in the elections, and ordering the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya, a Russian journalist critical of the Kremlin. Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium in 2006 and died soon after. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former owner of the oil giant Yukos and once Russia's richest man, received a 14-year prison sentence for corruption and tax crimes. Many argue his real offence was challenging the Kremlin. 2. Propaganda and media control. Nearly all newspapers and TV networks serve the government's interests. That means Putin filters what the Russian public knows about his regime, shaping a positive image, or at least limiting access to any critical narratives. In this environment, he doesn't need to force people to vote for him, because the only information available to them is almost always in his favour. This Russian propaganda machine is a direct descendant of how the Soviet Union used to control information flow. Just as Stalin built a cult of personality, decades ago, Putin's image gets constant reinforcement through state-aligned newspapers, TV channels, and social media. Putin claims he makes no more than $140,000 a year, about $12,000 a month, and says he only owns a 750-square-foot apartment. But reports from opposition figures and independent investigators suggest he indirectly holds a staggering fortune. There's allegedly a Putin palace on the Black Sea, said to be built by oligarchs close to him, along with a mega yacht valued at $100 million, aircraft, and a lavish watch collection. None of this, of course, is officially in his name. It's all tied to proxies, friends, or relatives. Staying in power also means maintaining that lifestyle without the paper trail catching up to him. Hence the theory that the longer he remains in the Kremlin, the lower the risk that a successor will dig into his affairs and expose any scandals. Up until the early 1990s, practically nobody outside local St. Petersburg politics had heard of Vladimir Putin. Today, he's among the most influential, yet also most feared, leaders on the global stage, presiding over a Russia that has returned to rattling multiple world powers, mainly due to its invasions and attempts to restore a glory that some associate with the days of the Empire or the Soviet Union. Putin isn't so different from the old Czars or even the authoritarian figures of Soviet times. He maintains a nationalist stance, portrays himself as a defender of traditional Russian values. He even has substantial support from the Russian Orthodox Church and views European powers and the United States as rivals. Many analysts say that deep down he never abandoned the Cold War mentality. Following his path, you see a chess player carefully plotting each move with an eye on long-term goals. His KGB roots heavily influence how he perceives the West, and the notion of an enemy remains front and centre. On numerous occasions, hackers linked to the Russian government have been accused of meddling in foreign elections and even targeting major sporting events, feeding into a digital conflict that some call Cold War 2.0. It's as though Putin is simultaneously serving the state and being served by it, and sometimes that line blurs entirely. He's willing to act without hesitation, even if it costs lives or wreaks havoc on Russia's own economy, as seen in 2022 when the invasion of Ukraine triggered a global wave of sanctions. Yet there's still much left to unfold in this story, particularly regarding how the European Union, NATO, and disgruntled Russians themselves, who risk protesting despite harsh crackdowns, will respond. Is he doing all this for the sake of national pride, trying to restore something that even the Soviet Union never fully achieved? Or is it purely a personal quest for prestige and power? So what do you think about Vladimir Putin and his true intentions? I'd love to hear your perspective on this documentary-style video. Leave a comment down below. Let's keep the conversation going. That's all for today. A big thank you, and I'll catch you later. Or better yet, see you in just a moment in the next video.